Well, good evening everybody. Welcome to our Planning Committee meeting number 236. As usual, the committee acknowledges the Wadawurrung people as the traditional owners of the land, waterways and skies. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and we acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are part of our greater Geelong community today. I'm pleased to be able to introduce to you tonight a number of councillors, most of us here in person. Councillor Highton, I'm Councillor Jim Mason chairing the meeting. We have Mayor Sullivan, Councillor Murray and Councillor Nelson. And online we have Councillors Contell and Councillor Maloney. We do expect Councillor Harwood, but we do have a quorum, so we're going to start on time, and he might be caught in traffic. We also have a number of officers here tonight. I'll introduce them to you. Mr. Steve Rusak, Principal Planner, Statutory Planning. Mr. Shane Pritchard, Team Leader, Statutory Planning. Mr. John Rush, Coordinator, Statutory Planning. And Ms. Joanne Van Sluggeren, Manager, City Development. I don't see Director Bradley here at the moment, but we do have Ms. Alana Martin over here, who is our newly appointed Chief Governance and Risk Officer, and Ms. Jacqueline Douglas, Coordinator Governance. We do have a number of apologies as well. Apologies from Councillors Hathaway, Cadwell and Wilkinson. We've just got a few procedural matters. Declarations of conflict of interest. Do we have any declarations of conflict of interest? No. We need to confirm the minutes of the previous meeting, which was held on the 14th of December 2023. Do we have any officers here, any councillors here who can move that? Councillor Aitken, seconded Councillor Sullivan. I'll put the motion. Those in favour? Carried. Thank you very much. I see Director Bradley has just arrived. Welcome. I just, as far as the procedures are concerned, we need to have all people online so they're clearly visible. As Councillor Maloney, have you faded out? Anyway, we still have a quorum. Anyway, we'll see what happens there. I would hope that we can come back online soon. Councillor Maloney. So that we will tonight be following the normal procedures for hearings, and just to go through those, many of you are familiar with them, but I will go through them anyway. So the procedures will be that the officer will present a brief summary of the written report of the committee, and that will be Mr. Rusak, who will give the first presentation. Following that, the panel may ask questions of the officer. Then the objector or objectors, submitters, will detail their concerns to the committee, and there will be a 3-minute time limit for each objector or each submitter. The panel may then ask questions of the objector submitter. The applicant will detail their application and respond to any objector submitter concerns to the committee, and that can be, we can give up 5 to 10 minutes for that process. The panel may then ask questions of the applicant, and then the panel will further discuss the application and make a final decision. If anybody is aggrieved with this decision of the committee, they may appeal to the Victorian Civil Administrative Tribunal in Melbourne, and our staff are always available to assist during office hours. So that's the way we're going to manage the meeting today. So in the first instance, Mr. Rusak.
Thank you, Councillor Mason. I get criticised for not speaking into the microphone, so please forgive me if I do. I'll do my best to stay clear. This is an application seeking planning approval for the construction of 10 apartments over 3 stories and a basement, multi-lot subdivision, and the alteration to vehicle access to Barrabool Road, which is in a road zone or a transport zone 2 managed by the Department of Transport. It's a larger than average site on the northwest side of Barrabool Road. It has about a 20-metre frontage to the road, about a 50-metre depth, and just under 1,000 square metres overall. Currently, it's developed for a single dwelling, mid-century dwelling, and established garden and outbuildings and garage. The land itself's in a general residential zone 4, and it is subject to the special building overlay, I should say. So just the one overlay, and the land does abut that road zone as well, which of course triggers the permit requirement for the alteration to vehicle access to the principal road network. The 3-storey apartment building comprises a basement car park and ramp entry off Barrabool Road that contains all of the car parking required for the development. The building set back 4 metres from the front boundary with balconies at the ground and mid-floor levels, and the upper front wall of the top storey, all within that, 4 metres or more from the front boundary. It has a contemporary building design to it, a contemporary use of materials including a mix of stone and metal mesh and cement cladding and smooth and textured finishes, so a contemporary mix of finishes. Vehicle accesses from a new double width vehicle crossing at the centre of the frontage. The ramp down to the basement accommodates, as I mentioned before, the car parking as well as waste facilities, bike parking and storage for the apartments. The plan of subdivision allows for the subdivision of the building once it's completed, so each of those apartments can exist on its own allotment with its own car parking spaces and storage areas. As it's required to be was referred to all of the external agencies, including the Catchment Management Authority or Floodplain Management Authority for consideration around flooding, also to the Department of Transport for consideration to the alteration to the access to the road, as well as, of course, Barwon Water as a Water and Sewerage Authority and Powercor as a Power Authority. All of those agencies have not objected to the grant of the permit subject to conditions. The application was also referred to our internal units here at Council, including Urban Design and Engineering and the other normal referral agencies internal to Council, and again, none have objected subject to conditions. The application was put to public notice in April last year. That attracted 10 objections in total, 8 of which were formal objections, 2 of which were received by Council via social media channels. Matters of concerns primarily related to concerns around increased traffic and parking congestion, concerns around traffic safety, pedestrian safety along Barrabool Road due to the additional dwellings and additional vehicle movements, Concerns around, of course, the development itself and its bulk, its height, its scale, being, I suppose, different to those along the street currently. Protection of vegetation and trees was a concern to some, as was issues around consideration of the urban heat island effect, which sometimes comes up in these sorts of developments in terms of objections. The application was assessed by stat planning against all of the requirements of the scheme, the zone, the overlay, of course, and the relevant policies. The application the proposal was found to be responding appropriately to meet an acceptable planning outcome in relation to almost all of those things. One of the primary matters for consideration, though, of course, is the residential development standards or res code standards, which, of course, all multiple dwelling developments, whether they be apartments or townhouses, are required to be assessed against. And there are 45 of those requirements. This development meets 44 of those 45 requirements, with the exception of one being the extent of overshadowing to the private open space of 3 dwellings on the southwest side of the building due to its height. Now, that was a matter that was raised at various points along the process. This is, I should say, an application that's been with the city now since 2020 and suffered the misfortune, if you like, of a rezoning soon after the application was received, from a time when the application, the land I should say, was in a residential growth zone, and many on the committee will remember that that strip along Barrabool Road was rezoned to general residential from residential growth at that time, late 2020 I think it was. Now that resulted in a requirement for the garden area, mandatory garden area, now to be met, which of course required a redesign of this development. So a lot of work went into meeting those new requirements, as well as addressing a range of matters that the office has brought up through the process, which explains why it's been with the city for what appears to be such a long time. Outstanding still, however, is the issue of overshadowing, which the officer, in this case myself, has determined to be significant, such that it doesn't meet the mandatory objective for overshadowing, which remains the single reason for recommending the refusal of the grant of a permit, unless that can be resolved, of course, and there may be ways of doing that, which the panel may be willing to explore tonight with the applicant. But on that basis, we respectfully recommend that no permit be granted unless those things can be resolved.
Thank you, Mr. Russo. Councillors, any questions?
Thank you, Chair. So just to clarify, so if the overshadowing issue was resolved, perhaps tonight, what would your recommendation be?
It would be to grant a permit. In fact, the overwhelming assessment of this proposal finds that it produces an acceptable outcome in relation to providing housing in an area that's suitable and well serviced. So there was a range of, as I said, the 45 residential development standards. Of all 45 of those, only one didn't meet the objective, which is mandatory, which was the overshadowing. If that can be resolved, we would end up in a situation where of the 45 standards, only 3 would be varied, which is entirely acceptable under normal circumstances with a development like this, to have variations to a small number of those, and that could be achieved by just some slight changes to the development, maybe reducing the shadow by setting back walls and that kind of thing. And I'm well aware that the applicant has been working on that very issue over the last, or over the period since it was reiterated, let's say, in preparation for tonight's meeting.
A follow-up question. I think I've heard you report that this process began in 2020, that there were complications with rezoning, and a number of amendments were consequent to that, or at least one amendment consequent to that, and a lot of work and redesign being done. But why is it we've waited to this 44 out of 45. Why has this not been addressed, this overshadowing?
Possibly a question to put to the applicant in their submissions tonight. From the council officer's perspective, I find it quite encouraging, I think, that developers and building designers are prepared to work with council officers in their recommendations around things like, in this case, it was things like ramp gradients, dealing with flooding issues and all of those sorts of things. If you like, there were a lot of issues to be resolved, including the garden area question. So the time it takes to do that is really a matter for the developer and their building design and their project team to work through. The reasons why it's come up at, let's say, at this late stage, I'd say that it was always an issue, but perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps it was missed. Perhaps, but look, there could be a range of reasons, but. Why wasn't it dealt with earlier on? I can't tell you that specifically.
I've got one other question. There's a flood wall, I think, to be installed where the basement, entrance to the basement. I think there was some redesign had to be done for that. Were there flood levels or something like that? Can you just tell us more about that?
I can. So. I'm just out of the corner of my eye seeing Councillor Maloney. Was Councillor Maloney saying something? Sorry.
I was saying the floodgate.
I wasn't sure if you were hearing us or not, but you are hearing us. What you're referring to there is, the idea of a floodgate, which in Geelong's not a commonly used technique, but it is used in urban areas that flood regularly to respond in the event of a flood to prevent entrance of flood water into basements. So apartment developments occur in lots of areas where these sorts of techniques are used. The redesign was partly to do with that, but more in fact to do with ensuring that the ramp entry to the basement allowed for vehicles to access and exit that ramp without scraping, and making sure that the ramp gradients were all correct so that it was convenient and safe access for the vehicles, perhaps less so than the floodgate itself. The floodgate, if just for the benefit of everybody to try and imagine, is in fact a structure that rises up, if you like, out of the floor during a flood to stop the water from running down the ramp. And these things are manufactured to specifications, and if they're installed to manufacturer's specifications, the engineering around these things is relatively straightforward. So the redesign was less to do with that and more to do with ensuring that the ramp gradients were appropriate.
Thank you. Councillors, any other questions? Councillor Murray.
Steve, there was what I would say a similar proposal in Barrabool Road maybe 12 months ago. Are you familiar with that? I think there was a three-storey development.
Direction up Barrabool Road.
Closer towards, closer to the Highton village.
I can remember that, Councillor Murray, that 16 Duggan Court. So that was before this committee, as you said. Time goes quick, it was over a year ago now. So yes, that was for a three-storey development on Barrabool Road, on the corner of Duggan Court and Barrabool Road. That also had some similarities to this and was recommended for support, and the planning committee supported that application.
Did that get a VCAT at all?
No, it didn't.
Councillor Murray. Any other questions, councillors? Okay, thanks, Mr. Russo. We'll now call on the objector that's been listed, and that is Ken and Ray Anderson. Ken, would you like to come forward, please? Yes, please. Make yourself comfortable.
Thank you. Our concern is not so much an objection as a clarification. The proponent of the development has suggested that they would recompense us for the shadowing of the solar on our property. I would want that to be hopefully verified at some stage. And secondly, the original design was for the pathway to go along the side of the boundary fence, which overlooks the rear of our property. And when we met with the developers, we did seek that the fence would be of adequate height, that people walking along there would not be able to look into our backyard. And secondly, that sufficient and appropriate tree screening would be planted between the boundary fence and the pathway. Those were our concerns, and I would like those to be addressed, please.
And you haven't had them you haven't had them fully addressed in your own mind
Well,
at this point.
verbally they were, but I'm not sure how that is addressed in the actual approval of a planning permit.
Okay, Ken, thank you.
Thank you.
Is that all you've got to say?
Yes, yes.
Councillors, any questions? No questions?
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. So now I'll call Marshall Sullivan, the applicant.
Good evening, councillors. My name's Marshall Sullivan. I'm a town planning consultant for this application. Just behind me, I've got the two building designers from Another Dimension Building Design, and I also have the clients here this evening as well. So this is an application for the construction of a 3-storey apartment building comprising of 10 dwellings. We're within an increased housing diversity area as identified in the Greater Geelong Planning Scheme. We have the required car parking spaces, which is 20 in total, to be distributed across the 10 dwellings. We are set back from all of the boundaries, and ultimately we comply with all but one objective of the provisions of Res Code, which I'll get to shortly. So we agree with the officer's report. We think it's an excellent report and addresses all of the issues. And we, apart from the recommendation to refuse, we accept and agree with those conclusions reached therein. And informing that position, obviously officers have agreed with the council's policy in relation to facilitating housing in appropriate locations. Those appropriate locations are identified specifically in the planning scheme. We need to facilitate more housing in the right locations. And in terms of figuring out where those right locations are, we are guided by the policy framework. In this case, not only are we within that area of increased housing diversity area, which are those areas that are ultimately within a 400-metre walking distance of activity centres. In this case, we're within 100 metres of the Highton Village Shopping Centre. We're within walking distance to public transport and also the active open space in Barrabool Road. And it's an ideal site to facilitate increased housing. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that you facilitate housing at all costs. It means that you deliver housing in the right locations and to an acceptable design standard that also makes sure that there's a reasonable level of impact to adjoining and nearby properties. And in this case, when we look at all of those provisions of Res Codes, we meet them all but overshadowing, which I'll get to again in a moment. In relation to the referrals that were received, both internally and externally, we receive full support, and that includes from our council's traffic unit, sustainability unit, our special building overlay design unit, which is the flooding team, and all other departments, and also externally, including Vic Roads and Barwon Water and all of those agencies. I've already touched on the increased housing diversity, nature of this site, but it is worth noting again, and that is dealt with at clause 1601-1L-02. It's a long provision of the scheme, and it does contemplate change. It does acknowledge that the character of an area will evolve. It has to evolve over time to facilitate more intensive development, and that's a direct quote from the provision of the policy framework. They should be close to those activity centres, and they should provide for a variety of housing types and lifestyle needs. And in this case, we do that. So in terms of what the key issue here is, it is overshadowing. And it's worth pointing out that we, and I'm sure councillors will be aware, but I will just go over this again just in terms of how Res Code is structured. It's made up of objectives and standards. So you must meet an objective, and then you should meet a standard. Now, if you meet the standard, typically, you then have deemed to have met the objective. Now, the question we have here is, in terms of the objective, is to ensure that we do not significantly overshadow existing secluded private open space areas. There's a standard that breaks that down and how that should be achieved. And when we go through that process, there's a variation sought. Now, there was a question before, why wasn't it addressed earlier? There was, this has been a long time in the making, this process and this application, and we were unfortunately impacted by a planning scheme amendment. This council actually wrote to the Minister to seek a change to that, to free up the rigid requirement for garden area requirements, but that wasn't changed. That caused some delays in addition to the need to work through a number of processes and issues raised, including flooding and other matters. And time has obviously got away. So there was no deliberate act, and obviously my client is desperate to get a decision of hopefully a favourable decision tonight, so that we can get on with this project now. In terms of how you go through then this overshadowing issue, we've taken on the report that was prepared by council, and we've now got a set of amended plans that we'd like to share with the council tonight. Now, through you, Mr. Chairman, are you happy for that to just come through via my colleagues at the back here while I can continue to speak, or how would we like to produce those plans?
Distribute them.
So what's being presented this evening is a set of revisions. Now, it's fundamentally what this is doing is results in a redesign to address the overshadowing concerns that were raised by officers. And just, now there's a lot to get through there, and there's a lot of technical detail, and the analysis is there. That was provided to officers a couple of days ago. We understand that there's the issue, that the variations that we're proposing and putting to you this evening do address the concerns. But what I'll do is just briefly, without forensically going through page by page, because we'll be here all night, what I wanted to do was just step through what we've effectively done and what the key changes result is, and we'll start with dwelling one. Now, in relation to dwelling one, the existing conditions that is caused by the existing dwelling currently doesn't comply with the standard of overshadowing, the overshadowing provisions. We're only addressing the overshadowing matters here. The redesign in relation to, this is the redesign that I'm talking to here, actually improves the overshadowing by approximately 50% from what the previous design was, and overall is actually a better outcome than the current situation. So, just to recap, currently doesn't comply. Our proposal does result in overshadowing, but the proposal that you have before you actually results in a better outcome. In relation to dwelling 2, again, we're in a situation where the current overshadowing of that secluded private open space doesn't comply. Redesign that you have before you results in approximately a 12% overshadowing of that secluded private open space area, but it represents an improvement from the 18.5%. Again, I don't want to forensically go through the table, but the data is there. So originally it was overshadowed at, just to confirm that. So originally it was roughly 18.86%, even though that's roughly, but we've actually improved that so that only 12% of that area is further overshadowed. So it is a variation of the standard, but the question is whether that 12% represents a significant overshadowing impact. To do that, actually before I say what I was just about to say, in relation to dwelling 3, we comply. So we don't have to do any further analysis of dwelling number 3 because that already complies with the standard. So what we need to do is focus on in what situation, and just turning our mind back to the objective that I read out a moment ago, which is to ensure buildings do not significantly overshadow an existing secluded private open space area, to determine what that what constitutes significant. You then have to step through the decision guidelines as outlined in Res Code. Now, the first decision guideline is the design response, and I'll try to be really quick. The design response.
You'll need to be brief because we're time up. I'll give you some time to wind up, though.
Minutes or 10
I'll
minutes?
give you time to wind up.
That was 10, okay.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, so the changes, because it's made up, the changes comprise of the upper level, the highest level, so level 3, and also the middle level, and what we've done is pushed those walls further, what would it be, north, because it's obviously the angle of the site, but in relation to the interface to the dwellings that we're overshadowing, we're pushing them further away. The overshadowing drawings are shown at, I might just grab one of these. Two parts to what we provided. One was the actual analysis, which is the actual A4 bit of paper. That's provided screenshots of the relevant overshadowing plans, and this is a lot to get through in terms of trying to address or provide amended plans to the committee on something like this.
I'm sorry, we're really running out of time. I want to give you an opportunity to get to the essentials of this. Can you, please proceed.
Okay, so P015 is where the overshadowing diagrams are. What we've done there is shown what the existing overshadowing is versus what the previous design was versus the now redesign. And ultimately what we're saying is when you look at that and the decision guidelines as to when it's appropriate to vary a standard, in this case, the key points are the fact, as I mentioned, the policy framework and the increased housing diversity area, the level of the impact in this case, the fact that the existing sunlight to all of the windows to the existing dwelling, including the solar panels, is protected, that all of the secluded private open space areas still achieve a good level of sunlight. The way that these dwellings are designed and the bay window nature mean that good solar access is always retained, and the fact that the middle unit, which is Unit 2, they didn't actually object. The last thing I'll say, because I'm sure there's probably some questions in relation to the detail, was that there was some comments made by our submitter, Mr. Anderson, and there was a question about the fence height and some landscaping. We'd be more than happy to address that as a condition of permit if the committee was of a mind to support our proposal this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for quickly winding that up. So, councillors, do we have any questions? I have a question to start with. I think we've got back to one of the significance words is actually the word significant. And I'm not quite sure, you've moved the building back so that there's less significant or a better outcome. But is the outcome actually, it still seems to be a subjective decision, whether it's better or is good enough.
There's two ways to do it.
I might have to ask the officers their opinions about this later, but I'd just like to hear from you more about that.
Yeah, thank you. And there's two ways to do this. There's the stepping through the decision guidelines as to in what situation is it appropriate and that extent, and then there's the numbers game. Now, when I say the numbers game, I mean the percentage and the actual area of the loss, which is really important. And what we're saying is that it's actually just shy of 12%, it's about 11.9% of the area is less than the standard. And when you consider 11% or that number, that's a low number. And we're already in a situation where that the existing conditions currently don't comply. We're dealing with one unit as opposed to all three, and all of the other properties around the whole area still achieve compliance. And then there's I guess the more subjective thing. Well, how do you balance infill housing and protecting, doesn't matter whether it's character or amenity or all of those things that must be considered. How do you balance all of those things to determine whether a development is appropriate? And in this case, when you look at the level of compliance, which is all aspects, every single part of this development complies with all other provisions of Res Code, all policy provisions, all referral authorities, all support it, and we're down to one matter, and it's a question of, does that level of impact result in such an amenity impact that this proposal fails? And that's the point that I was making in relation to the orientation and the design of these dwellings. They're still receiving really good access to sunlight, and then the windows are actually unaffected. The sunlight's still getting through to the windows, and we're actually improving a situation for Unit 1. So that's, hopefully, Mr Mason or Mr Chairman, that answers that question.
Thank you. I'm sorry, but I believe Councillor Maloney had a question. Sorry about that, Councillor Maloney.
No, that's all right. I was going to yell out if you weren't going to look around. That's all good. Thank you for the response. The objector who mentioned the overshadowing of the solar panels, can you clarify what amendments have been made to reconcile that?
The overshadowing drawings at P015 do show the extent of overshadowing, and it also shows the solar panels. So you can actually see when you analyse, you probably need to sort of close one eye and look closely down in the bottom right corner to determine what's already the shadow that's already cast, the line of the existing shadow and the line of the shadow as a result of the proposal. And you can see, what's the best one? And obviously when you're looking at shadowing, it's between the hours of 9 a.m. and 3 p.m, so it's always going to shift. And the orientation of our site, because we're in a northeast sort of angle, but when you actually look at the diagram, and all of them, in fact, there is some partial impacts at, for example, 9 a.m, which is probably the, I guess the. What have we got here? What's the best plan?
If you'd like to come forward, please.
Myself in the process.
Would you please introduce yourself?
Yep, sorry,
I'm Sash Mitseski from Another Dimension Building Design. We've been tasked with the project to design this project, and we've been dealing with Steve over the last few years for this. Now, in regards to overshadowing, in the equinox times, we don't overshadow the solar panels at all. One discussion that came to task when we did have an objection from the neighbours was what happens in winter, which is something that doesn't necessarily it's not something that's assessed during the process, but we were kind enough to produce drawings to show the winter effects. And that's, I guess, the question with that is, okay, what are the efficiency of the panels at those times? But with that, what we determined was there was some overshadowing in the winter months. This design actually improves those or lessens the impact. In those discussions, we did come up with a formula where we provided the objectors with a monetary compensation for that, but we would be happy to reassess that. But when we look at those shadows, it's those early mornings that we provide some shadow, obviously, because the sun's at a lower point. The redesign has, I guess, massively changed those overshadowing impacts to Unit 1 of all, because of just the recessive nature of those upper level walls. I'm not sure what more I can tell you without sort of pulling plans in front of you and showing those and pointing those out.
Well, that was a lot of words for not answering my question. I just wanted to know, the discussion that the objector had was about the impact, of which it has some, and you're kind enough to go and get those drawings to demonstrate that it was minimal. But I just wanted to know whether or not the constituents' question was answered within that report. It doesn't seem to have been at this point. So I guess that the answer, from what I can gather, is none, perhaps, or it hasn't been considered. So I guess that will be something I'll take into consideration. Thank you.
Well, except to say that the proposed redesign significantly improves the extent of overshadowing from the previous design. I'm not sure what else we can add to that, and we say that it complies with the requirements of the planning scheme.
Yeah, so there's been a number of questions involved in this, but just on the overshadowing and the question from Mr. Anderson, his solar panels are still, to some extent, have some overshadowing. Is that right?
Existing overshadowing.
The equinox and...
Equinox, no.
So I suppose we're going to have to ask the officers ultimately, what is the standard? Is the standard met or not? Officers.
Thank you. In effect, we're dealing with two different requirements of the scheme. When we're talking about overshadowing in terms of the grounds for refusal, that has to do with overshadowing or casting shadows into areas of people's backyards, let's say. The question of whether or not there's shadow impacts on someone's solar panels is dealt with a little bit separately by the planning scheme in a couple of ways, but primarily it says whether or not we have to assess as officers whether or not there is an effect on someone's existing solar panels. And if there is, there's some wording in and around that, but we have to make an assessment about whether it's acceptable. Now, at the shadow drawings that we see in the plans are always from the equinox, of course, but solar panels are measured right throughout the year. The performance of solar panels is measured right throughout the year. In this particular development, at the equinox, there was no effect on the solar panels, no meaningful effect on the solar panels. The meaningful effect came later in the year when the sun was lower in winter. And the work that the developer did to try and respond to the objectors' concerns, who were directly affected, and there's no one's disputing that whatsoever, and that's, as I understand it, what they're seeking clarification around. Where are we at now with this? And as I understand it, there was an offer made to the objector to compensate for loss, that small amount of loss. It's not a matter for council as a planning authority to involve itself in negotiations between neighbours around compensation for things. The planning scheme and the Act doesn't provide any mechanisms for that sort of thing. But if a developer and a neighbour want to resolve it that way, they are free to, which is why I think it may address Councillor Maloney's question. It's why you won't find in the officer's report talk about compensation and other things like that, because it's just not a planning matter. And finally, the redesign plans that we're seeing tonight are likely, in my assessment, to result in a lesser effect than before. In other words, whatever offer is on the table for the objector may in fact be more generous than it may need to be, but we don't have information around that. That is still a matter between the two neighbours. From an assessment perspective, is this an acceptable effect on someone's existing solar panel system? Before, it was my assessment that it was acceptable. And with the redesign, I'd say that it continues to be acceptable.
So there's another question. You said that there's two elements to this, and the other one is the imposition on private space, the overshadowing on a private space, and that was the reason it didn't meet the standards before. Does it meet the standards now?
Glad you brought it up, because yes, it was the only reason why my recommendation was to refuse. My reassessment of the drawings that you have in front of you is that if they make the changes that are proposed there, it will now result it will now no longer result in significant overshadowing. Therefore, it does meet the mandatory objective. So the answer is yes, it can be supported.
Okay. So I'm just looking to see if Councillor Maloney has another question. But while we're waiting for that, I'd just like to confirm then that Mr Anderson also asked two questions. He asked a question about his solar panels. I believe you believe that can be resolved. What about his question about the pathway?
To that was something that was raised in the discussions, and we did talk with Steve at the time about providing that as an amended plans condition, to provide sufficient screening and provide diagrams to show that there's no overshadowing along that pedestrian walkway. What I will add is that pedestrian walkway is ramped to the front door, so at points it's at ground level and then gradiates up to the floor level. So we wouldn't be opposed to providing plans to show that screening and add landscaping as part of an amended plans condition to sort of accommodate, and Steve, whether Steve passes that on to the objectors or neighbours to make sure that they're happy with it. We're more than happy to be accommodating for that. They're items that, again, under Res Code, we need to make sure there's screening from windows, and we do the same from a pedestrian walkway.
Thank you. Councillors, any other questions? Councillor Murray.
Thanks, Chair. I've got to say, this is a most unusual planning committee, I've got to say. We came here and believing that, well, after reading the papers that we received in preparation for tonight's meeting, there was an officer's refusal, and on the hop we've been given, I will ask a question, it's not just making a statement, fresh planning papers that we are now told that we rely on those, they comply with 44 out of the 44 requirements. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes, yep.
So the officer's recommendation would be to support this application?
Yes.
Is Mr Anderson aware, has he been spoken to about the changes that have occurred tonight? Was he given some warning about this? No?
Not from us, no. We don't have direct contact with Mr Anderson as an
Yeah.
objector. We've dealt with him via the council.
The other thing is, there was never any hiding of the fact that there was a variation sought to this provision from day one. This was always a variation. So this isn't a new matter that was raised. We're confident that the existing proposal that you've got before you, even you put these ones aside, still stand. They still hold, and it's a good outcome. But what we've done this evening is we've listened to the officers and we've worked closely with the officers. We've thought about it, and over the last week, the Another Dimension team have worked really hard, and thankfully we've got a client that's willing to make fairly, I suppose they're not major changes, but they are fairly decent changes that actually have a better outcome. So in this case, whilst it's unusual, it's a redesign that actually results in a greater improvement. There's no aspect of this where, you know, it's not as if in fact, even with a car parking situation, it's a better car parking arrangement because we've actually got an oversupply now. We've lost a bedroom of one of the dwellings. It's only reduced the level of impact. There's not one part that's actually raises a question, well, how could someone be affected? It's not, it's a better outcome. And that's what good planning is about as well, in terms of trying to work with our council and get those outcomes. So if we had more time, that would be great, but we don't, and we've now presented something to you that works really well.
Yes, well, of course, if we all had more time, we'd all have a clearer understanding. It's really unfortunate that we have this information at the 11th hour. It's not good practice. Councillor Nelson.
Thank you, Mr Chair.
We can't hear Councillor Nelson.
Sorry, Councillor Quintel. I'm just concerned that we've been handed plans, or some of us have been handed plans. Obviously, the two online haven't been handed plans. And are we allowed to vote on plans we've been given to in the middle of a meeting rather than what we're supposed to be voting on? Is that something that's even possible?
A question. Yes, you can vote on it. I think one thing that's got lost here is the change is a reduction to the first floor setback of roughly 1.8 metres, a reduction to the upper floor setback of 600 millimetres. They are two plans, changes to two plans. The rest of that package includes a lot of other information, some of which is relevant, some of which is part of the original submission, but we're only considering two plans. If council is of the mind to support the application, there would be an alternative recommendation to cover that setback change, and we would be endorsing that if it's supported.
And that after 4 years, there's been ample time to change these plans, and we're getting them at 6 o'clock. Well, we did get them at 6 o'clock for the application, and then submit another application. It's been I'm just concerned that I'm making a decision that affects a lot of people without much knowledge of what's actually occurred. And the original plans have that overshadowing component that is really significant. I'm concerned. I'm all for diverse housing types, I get that. But I'm concerned that we've been asked to vote on something that's just been handed to us
Councillor Nelson,
and not given to all of us as well.
Councillor Nelson, I'm going to receive some advice on this. I'm going to speak with the governance people for a moment, and in that time I'm going to adjourn the meeting for a few minutes, you'll just be patient with me, I will discuss with the governance.
Thanks, Jim.
Is Councillor Maloney there? Councillor Maloney? Now, following our most recent discussions and the question from Councillor Nelson, the result of my briefing from the governance people is that we have now decided that we will defer this meeting. The meeting will be closed shortly. We will defer this meeting subject to further work by the officers. And the next meeting will be at an appropriately defined time. Joanne, you have something else to say?
Need to move and second the deferral.
In that sense, the governance advice is to defer the meeting. I would therefore call for a mover and a seconder. Moved, Councillor Murray. Seconded, a deferral. Councillor Aitken. Any discussion?
Mr Chair, if I may. Just procedurally, just clarification, we've got a recommendation of plans that have been submitted and assessed by the Planning Department before us. A last-minute variation has been submitted by the applicant, which then enables further work to be done. I'm worried about a precedence we're setting here that if an application comes to us with a recommendation for refusal, it may create precedence that prior to a vote, new plans can be submitted, meeting can be deferred, pushed down the road. If a recommendation for refusal maintains, new plans may be submitted on the night. I'm just worried we're creating an instance where, excessive time is being provided to applicants outside of standard processes.
Point well taken. It's always a balancing act. What I can say at this point in time, I've received advice from our governance unit of this council that the best course of action in this case is to defer. Councillor Aitken.
It's actually not a precedent that hasn't happened before. To give councillors confidence, we have deferred planning meetings before if we have had to actually discuss in more detail. So the reason why it's been suggested to defer is so that we, the planning officers can actually give good advice to the councillors and ensure that we make the correct and appropriate decision. If we were to reject deferral of the meeting or reject the application tonight, it actually means a much longer process would be undertaken. So to give the councillors confidence that may not have actually experienced this before, it has happened before where we have deferred decisions. It's a formal process, so essentially we're not, the item and agenda is still listed. The discussion on the item is actually deferred and a decision is deferred until a later date, and officers can present additional information and advice to the councillors before they do make their recommendation. What has happened in the past that's been difficult is not all the same councillors actually attend the meeting where it is deferred. This actually is a constituted meeting of the City of Greater Geelong, so in fact all 11 councillors can attend the meeting, and if it is deferred, all 11 councillors can attend the next meeting as well too, so it actually doesn't rely on each of these us to attend again. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Aitken. So I think they were points of clarification for the point of procedure. We have a mover and a seconder. Now, do we have any other discussion? Councillor Maloney? Oh, Councillor Contel.
Just really a quick comment. I think given that I've seen the new plans, I think the deferral is probably the right course of action, at least for me being online, because I hate to either reject the proposal if it's fair and reasonable, or support it if it's not, without at least seeing these most recent plans. And certainly the dialogue and discussion was good from the applicant, but without seeing the plans, I'd really be voting on something where I'm blind, and I'd prefer to make sure that I'm voting on the facts, and I just don't have them in front of me, unfortunately.
Thank you, Councillor Contel. Any other councillors to discuss this matter? I'd just like to add in a final point that these difficulties arise when last-minute actions are taken when there's been plenty of time earlier. So I'll just leave it at that, and I'll put the motion. Those in favour of deferral? Carried. Thank you. I'll close the meeting.